the skies over Europe were a theater of war. It was early 1943, and a pale winter sun barely pierced through thick banks of cloud. Above those clouds, a thunderous formation of aircraft carved its way through the cold air. They were big four-engine bombers flying in a tight, determined pattern. Their deep, rumbling engines could be heard long before they came into sight. These were Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses, the backbone of the U.S. Army Air Force's daylight bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. For German fighter pilots accustomed to nimble Messerschmitts and deadly Focke-Wulfs, the sight was almost comical. They saw these massive aircraft as little more than lumbering steel barns crawling across the sky. To many Luftwaffe veterans, the American bombers were simply targets, slow, predictable, and vulnerable. Around airfields in occupied France and Germany, fighter crews joked about how quickly they would send the flying fortresses crashing down. At first glance, their confidence made sense. The B-17 was heavy, and compared to a fighter it was slow. It could not outturn or outclimb an interceptor. The German fighters had proven themselves over Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Surely these American bombers were just another enemy to be dispatched with the same brutal efficiency. But the B-17 had been designed with a very specific purpose: to endure. Every inch of its aluminum skin, every spar and rivet of its frame had been engineered to keep it in the air long enough to deliver its bomb load and, if at all possible, bring its crew home. Its four Wright Cyclone engines were powerful yet reliable, and its fuselage bristled with defensive firepower. Up to 13.50 caliber Browning machine guns gave the Flying Fortress overlapping fields of fire from nose to tail. When the first deep penetration raids into German territory began, Luftwaffe fighters attacked in coordinated waves. They tore into the bomber formations, pouring cannon shells and machine gun fire into wings, cockpits, and engines. Early losses were heavy, but something began to trouble the German pilots. Again and again, bombers they were sure had been fatally hit continued flying. Aircraft with great holes in their wings or tails still held formation. Crews inside patched hydraulic leaks in flight, administered morphine to wounded gunners, and fought to keep their battered ships in the sky. The stories spread quickly through Allied air bases in England. Ground crews watched in astonishment as crippled B-17s limped back to land, sometimes with one or even two engines out, sometimes with their tail sections nearly severed. Yet somehow, improbably, the bombers landed. Each safe landing was a morale boost, a testament to the aircraft's toughness and the determination of its crews. This resilience slowly began to shift the psychological balance of the air war. German pilots had started out laughing at the Flying Fortresses. But the laughter began to fade as they realized the bombers were not as easy to destroy as they had imagined. The defensive fire was intense, and closing in on a formation meant flying through a blizzard of .50 caliber rounds. Losses among German fighters began to mount, and with each raid the Americans refined their tactics, tightening formations, coordinating escort fighters, and adjusting altitude and approach routes. In these early months, the B-17's reputation was being forged not in a propaganda office but in the frozen skies of Europe. The Flying Fortress was showing both sides that it was aptly named. It was a fortress and it would keep coming back. And this was just the beginning. In the next phase of the campaign, the B-17 would be pushed to its limits on deeper and deadlier missions, testing the courage of its crews and the might of the aircraft itself. By the summer of 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortress had become a familiar silhouette over occupied Europe. From the coast of France to the factories of the Ruhr, civilians and soldiers alike could look up and see the glint of sunlight on those long wings and four roaring engines. Each time the sirens wailed and contrails scarred the blue sky, people knew the Americans were coming again. Inside the Luftwaffe, the attitude toward the B-17 was shifting from dismissive to wary. German pilots were still confident in their skills, but after each raid more of their comrades failed to return. The bombers were expensive in blood and effort to bring down. The Reich's air defense network, fighters, flak batteries, radar stations, was being strained. Even with dozens of interceptors scrambling to meet every formation, the Flying Fortresses were proving stubborn targets. The Americans, meanwhile, were learning fast. New crews arriving in England were drilled relentlessly on tight formation flying. Each aircraft was not just an individual bomber but a moving gun platform in a defensive grid. When flown properly, 3 squadrons of B-17s could create interlocking arcs of .50 caliber firepower so dense that German fighters had to think twice before diving in. Pilots and gunners gave their aircraft nicknames: Memphis Belle, Shoo Shoo Baby, Hell's Angel, and painted nose art that mixed humor with grim determination. To the young men inside, each mission was a gamble. Survive 25 operations, and you went home. Few reached that number early in the campaign. Still, crews suited up in leather jackets and oxygen masks climbed aboard their fortresses at dawn and rolled down long concrete runways into the cold morning sky. German pilots developed new tactics to counter the bombers. Instead of attacking from behind where defensive fire was strongest, they began head-on assaults, firing 20 and 30mm cannons as they roared past the formation. They coordinated massed attacks, hitting bombers from multiple directions at once. The Luftwaffe even experimented with upward-firing cannons installed in night fighters pressed into daytime duty, hoping to slip under the bombers' blind spots. Yet even these measures could not completely blunt the flying fortress. Its rugged construction absorbed punishment beyond anything the designers had imagined. Wing spars held despite direct hits. Self-sealing fuel tanks limited fires. Redundant systems allowed pilots to maintain control even when hydraulic or electrical lines were severed. Crews would sometimes jettison weight, shut down damaged engines, and coax their wounded planes back to England one agonizing mile at a time. One famous example circulated through Allied newspapers: a B-17 returning with its nose sheared away yet still flying, another with a gaping hole through its fuselage large enough for a man to crawl through. These images became powerful symbols of American industrial strength and the resilience of the crews. For the Luftwaffe, the psychological toll was real. Veteran pilots wrote in diaries about their frustration. They could damage the enemy but could not stop the relentless flow of bombers and crews arriving from across the Atlantic. The U.S. was ramping up production at a scale Germany could not match. Even if a formation lost 10 or 20 aircraft, another would take its place the next week. The Reich was beginning to face an opponent who could afford losses while inflicting ever greater damage on its war economy. By mid-1943, the raids went deeper, beyond the French coast to Hamburg, Bremen, Schweinfurt, Regensburg. Each mission stretched the limits of the B-17's range and endurance. Crews flew for hours over hostile territory, oxygen masks frosting, flak bursting around them, German fighters slashing in. Losses remained high. On the first Schweinfurt raid alone, 60 B-17s were lost, yet the survivors returned with proof they had hit one of Germany's most vital ball-bearing plants. This was the grim arithmetic of strategic bombing. The price was terrible, but the potential reward was crippling the enemy's ability to wage war. The Flying Fortress, by its very name and nature, embodied that gamble. In England, ground crews worked tirelessly to patch up the returning aircraft. They riveted fresh panels over holes, replaced engines, and rearmed the guns. Within days, the same bombers that had limped home with smoke trailing from their wings were back in formation, engines roaring, heading east once again. For German observers, this was demoralizing. How could they win when even the planes they nearly destroyed yesterday were back over their skies tomorrow? By late 1943, whispers began circulating through the Luftwaffe. Perhaps the Americans' Flying Fortress was not a joke after all. Some pilots admitted they dreaded attacking the tight boxes of bombers, knowing the odds of survival were shrinking. Others, fiercely loyal to the Reich, doubled down, volunteering for ramming attacks or using experimental weapons. But none of it stopped the steady advance of the Allied air campaign. The B-17 had moved beyond being merely an airplane. It was becoming a symbol of persistence, of an industrial democracy hurling its might across an ocean to batter the heart of a dictatorship. Each mission written into flight logs was a small step toward opening the path for D-Day and the liberation of Europe. As the year turned and winter returned, the Flying Fortress continued to evolve. Crews gained experience, Tactics improved. Escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang began appearing in greater numbers to guard the bombers deep into enemy territory. The stage was being set for an even more dramatic clash in the skies, a test not only of machines but of the resolve of the men flying them. This was only the middle act of the story. The next phase would push the B-17 and its crews into the deadliest missions yet, where even its legendary toughness would be tested to the edge, and where the mocking laughter of the Luftwaffe would be replaced with grim respect. Winter settled hard over England in early 1944. Frost clung to the wings of parked aircraft, and the long dawns were lit by the glow of maintenance crews working under floodlights. Inside the Nissen huts, B-17 crews were briefed on missions that would take them farther into Germany than ever before. Charts, photographs, and weather reports covered the walls. The targets now were not just factories on the periphery but the heart of the Reich: Berlin, Leipzig, and the aircraft plants of central Germany. For the men in the flying fortresses, each mission began the same way. Coffee gulped down in the dark, heavy flight suits pulled on, parachutes checked, oxygen masks tested. Outside, the bombers stood in rows like steel sentinels waiting to rise. By now, veterans had flown dozens of sorties. They knew every groan of the fuselage, every rattle of the gun mounts, every small ritual to steady their nerves before takeoff. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe was in crisis. The Battle of the Atlantic had choked off oil supplies, and Allied bombing campaigns had hit key fuel refineries. Fighter wings were stretched thin, pilots rushed through training, and many veterans lost. But despite dwindling resources, the Reich threw everything it could at the incoming bombers. New weapons appeared: rocket-firing interceptors, heavy cannon mounted on twin-engine fighters, even the first jet-powered Me-262 prototypes tested in combat. Each was an attempt to blunt the American aerial spear driving into German industry. The B-17 crews, however, were no longer alone. By 1944, the long-range P-51 Mustang escorts had arrived in force. Sleek and fast, the Mustangs could dive with the German fighters and chase them all the way back to their bases. This changed the air war dramatically. For the first time, the bombers were shielded from start to finish, and Luftwaffe pilots had to fight their way through a curtain of Allied fighters before even reaching the bomber boxes. Still, the missions were punishing. Berlin in particular was ringed with some of the heaviest anti-aircraft artillery in the world. Shells burst in black puffs across the sky, filling the bombers' paths with deadly shrapnel. Crews flew at altitudes where the temperature plunged far below freezing, oxygen masks icing over, fingers stiff in thick gloves as they gripped control yokes or machine guns. One harrowing mission to Leipzig saw multiple bombers hit before reaching the target. A B-17 named Bitless took a direct hit to its right wing, tearing away a portion of the flap. Yet the pilot held it steady, dropping his bombs and turning for home on 3 engines. Another fortress limped back with its top turret destroyed and both waist gunners wounded, its fuselage a sieve of holes but still flying. These stories were no longer rare. They had become the grim, routine heroics of the 8th Air Force. German pilots, meanwhile, were confronting a new reality. Once, they had mocked the flying fortress as a slow and easy kill. Now, it was part of an Allied aerial machine that seemed unstoppable. A Luftwaffe ace later recalled, "We began to see the American formations as a wall of steel. It was no longer about one bomber, it was about hundreds. For every bomber they brought down, several more appeared the next week, escorted by swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The attrition was relentless." In Berlin, ordinary citizens noticed the change too. The sky no longer carried a few scattered contrails but a web of them stretching horizon to horizon. Air raid sirens wailed almost daily. Fires burned for days after raids. The psychological weight of constant bombardment began to sap German morale. The myth of invulnerability inside the Reich was crumbling. Inside the flying fortresses, the crews themselves transformed from green rookies to hardened veterans. Gunners learned to lead targets precisely, pilots refined formation turns to minimize vulnerability, and bombardiers grew adept at threading their payloads through gaps in the clouds. Each mission written into logbooks added another scar to the aircraft and another layer of experience to the men inside. By now the B-17 was not only a weapon but a symbol. Its very silhouette meant the Allies had come to stay. Newspapers back in the United States printed photos of battered bombers returning, headlines proclaiming, "Fortress beats odds again." Families clipped these stories, seeing in them proof that their sons, brothers, and husbands had a fighting chance to come home. In the spring of 1944, the scale of operations grew again. Thousands of bombers rose from England's airfields in coordinated waves, hitting marshalling yards, bridges, and factories crucial to the German war machine. These strikes were not random but carefully timed to prepare for the coming invasion of Normandy. Each bridge destroyed, each railway line severed was another step toward D-Day. For the Luftwaffe, the skies were turning against them. Pilots wrote bitter letters about facing endless bomber streams and deadly escorts. Some described the terror of flying into a formation's defensive fire, tracers streaking past their cockpits, engines shuddering under hits. Loss rates among German fighter units skyrocketed. The once elite force of 1939 was now a shadow of itself, fighting a defensive war it could not win. Yet even amid this attrition, there were fierce battles. Luftwaffe commanders launched massed attacks during key raids, throwing every available aircraft into the path of the bombers. Sometimes the sky over Germany turned into a swirling melee of contrails, gunfire, and exploding aircraft. Crews in the B-17s watched dogfights unravel above and below them while holding their own formation steady, knowing that one slip could open a gap for an attacker. Despite all of this, the flying fortress kept coming back. Crippled planes landed on one wheel, skidded off runways, or bellied in on frozen fields. Crews crawled out, shaken but alive, and within days the aircraft, or its replacement, was in the air again. This cycle of destruction and return wore down the Luftwaffe's hope of stopping the Americans. By mid-1944, with D-Day looming, the B-17 had helped grind down Germany's air defenses to a fraction of their former power. The Allies controlled the daytime skies over Western Europe. This dominance would make the invasion possible and would push the war into its final, brutal stages. The Flying Fortress had thus completed its transformation in the eyes of friend and foe alike. No longer mocked, it was feared, respected, and, above all, enduring. The Luftwaffe pilots who once laughed at the steel barns now spoke of them with grim respect. The fortress in the sky had lived up to its name. And yet, the deadliest months still lay ahead. As the Allies advanced and German desperation grew, new weapons, tactics, and sacrifices would test the B-17 and its crews to the very limit. The next chapter of their story would unfold over Normandy, the Ardennes, and finally over the heart of a collapsing Reich. June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the English Channel. Below, an armada of ships steams toward the beaches of Normandy. Above, the roar of aircraft fills the sky. This is D-Day, the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, and overhead the B-17 Flying Fortress plays a crucial role. Months of relentless bombing had paved the way for this moment, smashing bridges, railways, and airfields across France. Now, as Allied troops push ashore, the fortresses are in the sky again, hammering German positions and preventing reinforcements from reaching the beaches. By the summer of 1944, the Flying Fortress has become a familiar and feared weapon of war. It is no longer making occasional raids, it is conducting daily operations at a scale no air force had ever attempted. Entire groups of bombers rise from England, form up into great aerial armadas, and cross the channel escorted by sleek Mustangs and Thunderbolts. Below, German soldiers and civilians alike know the pattern of engine sounds by heart. The once mocked steel barns now symbolize the inevitability of defeat. Inside each B-17 on D-Day morning, crews are tense but focused. Many have flown dozens of missions. They check their oxygen systems, adjust gun sights, and keep eyes peeled for the thin black puffs of flak rising from German guns below. They know the Luftwaffe is weakened but not finished. Isolated fighters still dive out of the sun, cannons blazing. Yet the American formations are tighter and their escorts deadlier than ever. German pilots who break through the fighter screen face the overlapping arcs of machine gun fire from dozens of bombers. Few survive. The flying fortress has evolved too. Newer models have better armor, improved turrets, and refined bomb sights. Crews have become expert at synchronizing their releases, turning entire city blocks or rail yards into fields of craters. The Luftwaffe, once master of Europe's skies, can only mount scattered resistance. Allied escort fighters now roam freely over French airfields, strafing runways and destroying aircraft before they can take off. As the Normandy campaign unfolds, B-17s are tasked with cutting every road, bridge, and railway leading to the invasion zone. Day after day, formations of fortresses fly at medium altitudes, sowing destruction across northern France. German commanders plead for reinforcements, but trains are derailed, bridges collapsed, and convoys bombed from the air. The once efficient German logistics network is breaking under the weight of Allied air power. For the crews of the flying fortresses, the missions are still dangerous. Flak batteries in France and Belgium are dense and deadly. Some bombers explode in midair, others ditch in the channel or crash land in fields behind the front lines. Yet the majority return, patched and ready to go again. On the ground in England, mechanics work around the clock replacing engines, riveting fresh aluminum over shrapnel holes, and loading thousands of pounds of bombs for the next strike. In Berlin and other German cities, the sight of the flying fortress has become routine but no less terrifying. The sound of their engines carries a message: no city is safe, no factory beyond reach. Even hardened civilians glance upward when the contrails appear, remembering the nights of British bombers and the days of the American fortresses. The Reich's propaganda can no longer hide the scale of destruction. Meanwhile, German fighter units are fighting a losing battle. Fuel shortages cripple training and limit flight time. Veteran pilots are lost faster than they can be replaced. Many new recruits are barely out of flight school, thrown into combat against massive bomber formations and aggressive escorts. The psychological toll is immense. Luftwaffe pilots write in diaries of nightmares about endless silver planes filling the sky. Yet the B-17 crews, for all their industrial support and training, are not immune to fear. Each takeoff could be their last. They memorize escape routes, carry silk maps and survival kits, and whisper quiet prayers as they cross the coast. Inside the cramped fuselage, the temperature plunges far below freezing, oxygen hisses through frosted lines, and the smell of gun oil mixes with sweat. They fly for hours over hostile territory, every minute a test of endurance. In late summer 1944, as the Allies break out of Normandy and race across France, the flying fortress shifts its focus again, now targeting the German homeland with even greater intensity. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft assembly lines, all become priority targets. Each raid cuts deeper into Germany's ability to sustain the war. Even the most skeptical observers admit the daylight bombing campaign is achieving its goal. The Luftwaffe is being destroyed not just in combat but at its industrial roots. The sheer scale of the American effort is staggering. By autumn, thousands of B-17s and other bombers are flying missions almost daily. Supply lines from the United States deliver replacement aircraft, spare parts, and fresh crews in a steady stream. For every fortress lost, another arrives to take its place. German pilots who once believed they could bleed the Americans into quitting now see the opposite, a relentless tide they cannot stop. As Allied armies approach the German border, the flying fortress begins striking targets deeper than ever before. Berlin itself becomes a regular destination. Each trip to the capital is a gauntlet of flak and fighters, yet the bombers push through. Photographs taken after raids show smoking ruins where once stood vital war plants. The psychological impact on Germany's leadership is profound. They realize the Reich cannot match such industrial and logistical power. For the American crews, these missions forge a sense of shared ordeal. They decorate their planes with fresh bomb markings after each sortie, tallying their progress toward the magic number that will send them home. Yet home feels further away than ever. Friends are lost, replacements arrive, and the war grinds on. The flying fortress becomes not just a weapon but a second home, a steel cocoon carrying them through the sky, bearing scars like its crew. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe's daylight defense of the Reich is effectively broken. The The skies belong to the Allies. But the story of the B-17 is not over. Ahead lie the frozen battles of the Ardennes, desperate German counterattacks, and the final hammer blows that will shatter the Nazi war machine. The flying fortress, once mocked and doubted, will be there until the very end. December 1944. A bitter winter grips Europe. Snow lies thick on airfields in England, and a pale sun struggles to rise through the freezing mist. On the ground, Allied armies have pushed deep into France and Belgium, but in the forests of the Ardennes, a surprise German offensive is underway. This is the Battle of the Bulge, the last great counterattack of the Third Reich, and once again the B-17 flying fortress will play a decisive role. In the opening days of the German assault, bad weather grounds most Allied aircraft. Low clouds and snowstorms give the German armored columns cover as they push west, overwhelming thin American lines. Pilots and crews in England wait anxiously for the skies to clear. Inside the cold Nissen huts, they listen to radio reports of Bastogne under siege, of bridges blown and towns captured. They know that when the weather breaks, the burden of stopping the offensive will fall heavily on the bombers and their escorts. On December 23rd, the weather finally clears. The flying fortresses roar to life, engines echoing across frozen airfields. Crews scramble into their aircraft, faces pale with cold and determination. Today's targets: road junctions, bridges, and supply depots feeding the German advance. As the sun rises, the sky over England fills with contrails once more. After days of silence, the Luftwaffe looks up to see the familiar silver armadas returning to the skies. Flying into the Ardennes, crews see a white world below, forests blanketed in snow, roads etched like black scars, smoke rising from burning towns. Anti-aircraft guns hidden among the trees send up bursts of flak. German fighters, short of fuel but desperate, dart in from low altitudes. Yet the bombers hold formation, guided by radar and visual markers, striking with precision despite the winter haze. Their payloads crash into bridges and fuel dumps, choking the lifeblood of the German attack. For the men on the ground, the effect is immediate. American troops in foxholes watch with relief as B-17 formations thunder overhead, bombing German positions ahead of counterattacks. Truck convoys carrying supplies to the front are shredded from above, and key crossroads are cratered beyond use. The German offensive, already strained, begins to falter under the weight of Allied air power. Soldiers later say the sound of the flying fortress engines was the sweetest music they had ever heard. Inside the bombers, conditions are brutal. Temperatures at altitude drop to -40 degrees. Frost creeps across instrument panels, oxygen masks ice up, and gun barrels seize from the cold. Crews wear layer upon layer of wool and sheepskin, fingers numb as they feed ammunition into their guns. Yet discipline holds. Bombardiers peer through Norden sights, pilots wrestle heavy controls, and gunners scan the skies for specks of enemy fighters. Each minute aloft is a battle against both the enemy and the elements. The Luftwaffe throws what it can into the fight. Me-109s and FW-190s streak through the low clouds, attacking from head-on and from below, seeking to break the formations apart. Some carry rockets, others heavy cannons, trying to punch through the armored bombers. But the American escorts, Mustangs and Thunderbolts, are waiting. Dogfights erupt over the snowbound landscape, contrails twisting into spirals as fighters duel at high speed. German pilots know that even if they bring down a bomber, they may not survive the return trip. Back at base, ground crews work with frozen hands to prepare the next missions. Engines are warmed with heaters, bombs rolled across icy tarmac, machine gun belts refilled. The pace is relentless. The flying fortress has become an industrial weapon of war, each aircraft a moving piece in a vast, coordinated strike system. Crews fly, land, debrief, and fly again, often with only hours of rest between missions. Throughout the winter campaign, stories of the B-17's toughness continue to spread. One bomber limps home with half a stabilizer shot away. Another loses 2 engines and lands on a frozen runway, skidding to a halt amid cheers from the ground crew. Photographs show aircraft riddled with holes, landing gear collapsed, yet crews alive and smiling weakly. Each battered return is proof to thousands of servicemen that the fortress in the sky can take punishment and still bring its people back. As the Battle of the Bulge turns against Germany, the flying fortress expands its targets once more. Factories deep inside the Reich, oil plants near the Rhine, and transportation hubs feeding the Eastern Front all come under sustained attack. The once feared Luftwaffe jets, the Me-262s, appear more frequently now, their speed astonishing but their impact limited by fuel shortages and Allied fighter tactics. Even cutting-edge weapons cannot reverse the tide. By early 1945, the strategic picture is unmistakable. The Allies dominate the skies. German cities lie in ruins, their industrial output crippled. The B-17 has helped achieve what once seemed impossible, daylight precision bombing on a scale that has broken the enemy's capacity to wage war. German pilots who once mocked the bomber now speak of it with grim respect, describing its walls of fire and its relentless returns to the skies. In the crew's own minds, the flying fortress is more than aluminum and engines. It is a lifeline, a companion, and sometimes a coffin. They name their planes with affectionate or defiant titles: Shoo Shoo Baby, Ninonin, a bit of lace, painting pin-up girls or mascots on the nose as talismans. They celebrate each successful mission with a bomb stencil on the fuselage, each a silent tribute to the risk survived. Even as the Reich crumbles, the missions remain deadly. Flak batteries near key targets grow thicker, and desperate German fighters launch suicide-style attacks on the bomber streams. But the balance has shifted irrevocably. For every B-17 lost, the Allies replace it with two more. For every pilot killed, another trained crew steps forward. The industrial and human power of the United States has turned the tide of the air war beyond reversal. On the ground in newly liberated towns, civilians greet the bomber crews with gratitude. They know these aircraft helped sever German supply lines, hastening the end of occupation. Yet they also see the devastation left behind: wrecked railways, smoldering depots, and shattered infrastructure. The flying fortress, for all its precision, is still a blunt instrument of total war. As the snow begins to thaw and Allied armies cross the Rhine, the flying fortress is poised for its final campaigns. Ahead lie the last raids over a collapsing Reich, the liberation of prisoner-of-war camps, and the dawning realization that the war in Europe will soon be over. The bomber, once mocked as a steel barn, has become an icon of persistence, its engines the drumbeat of inevitable victory. And beyond the immediate war, a new legacy is forming. Engineers and pilots begin to envision a post-war world of long-range flight and heavy transport, technologies pioneered in part by the lessons of the flying fortress. But for the men still flying missions, the future is a distant thought. Their focus is on survival, on one more takeoff, one more target, one more return home. The B-17 has carried them through the darkest skies of the conflict. Now, in the winter of 1944-45, it carries the hope of ending the war altogether. March 1945. The war in Europe is entering its last act. Allied armies have crossed the Rhine, the Red Army is closing in from the east, and the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, is a spent force. Yet for the crews of the B-17 flying fortress, the missions continue. Every day they lift off from the damp, muddy airfields of England and France, engines drumming a steady rhythm, heading into the heart of a collapsing Reich. By now the flying fortress is as familiar to its crews as their own homes. The smell of hydraulic fluid and gun oil, the vibration of four big radial engines, the groan of the fuselage under stress, these are the background to their lives. Many of the faces in the crew positions have changed over the months, but the ritual remains: pre-flight checks, formation takeoff, long hours of steady flying punctuated by moments of violent danger. The targets now lie deep inside a Germany under siege, rail yards feeding retreating troops, oil refineries fueling the last tanks, and military installations near Berlin itself. The missions are designed to ensure that German forces cannot regroup or establish new defensive lines. For the men inside the B-17s, the sense of a coming end is palpable, but so is the risk. Even a dying enemy can still shoot back. Over the Ruhr Valley, flak is as thick as ever. The Germans have moved their anti-aircraft guns to protect the last vital targets. Black bursts pepper the sky, each one a cloud of jagged steel. The crews of the flying fortresses watch the explosions roll toward them, hoping their number will not come up. They know from experience that a direct hit can tear through armor plating, that a single shell can cripple an engine or maim a crewmate. Still they fly on, holding formation, trusting in their aircraft and each other. The Luftwaffe's presence is smaller now but in some ways more dangerous. Young, barely trained pilots take off in obsolete fighters to hurl themselves at the bomber streams. The Me-262 jets, when they appear, flash past at incredible speeds, spitting cannon shells before disappearing into the clouds. But the escorts are always there, P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and even the long-range P-38 Lightnings. Dogfights rage on the fringes of the bomber formations while the flying fortresses press forward toward their targets. Inside the cockpits and gun positions, life continues in the rhythms of long war. Navigators plot courses, radio operators listen for coded signals, and gunners scan the skies for any movement. At 25,000 feet, the cold is so intense that moisture freezes inside oxygen masks, gun barrels frost over, and exposed flesh can freeze in seconds. Yet crews have adapted. They tape over drafts, wear extra gloves, and keep thermoses of hot coffee wedged near the radios. They know each other's habits, quirks, and silences. In many crews the bond is closer than family. Each raid now feels like both routine and finale. The airmen are veterans of Normandy, the Ardennes, and countless runs over Germany's industrial heartland. They have seen their friends' planes explode beside them, and they have watched crippled fortresses descend into cloud banks never to emerge. They have also seen miracles, aircraft limping home on one engine, tails shredded, wings full of holes. The B-17's reputation for toughness is no longer a rumor but a lived truth. It has saved thousands of lives by simply refusing to fall out of the sky. On the ground, German civilians and soldiers alike witness the relentless tide of silver bombers. Where once a few dozen aircraft might appear, now hundreds cross the sky at once, contrails weaving into a single pale ceiling over entire regions. Air raid sirens wail constantly. Factories that once churned out weapons of war now stand roofless, their machinery twisted and silent. The flying fortress has become not just a weapon but a symbol of inevitability, of a war that cannot be won. In the Allied camps, the crews sense the change in mood. Briefings still stress vigilance, but the tone is different. Commanders talk about post-war assignments, about rotation schedules, about home. Some men start thinking about what they will do when they get back. Study, farm, marry, open a business. Yet each mission demands the same focus as the first. Overconfidence can be fatal. A single burst of flak or a lone fighter with nothing to lose can still end a veteran crew's war in an instant. The B-17 itself has evolved into its ultimate form. Improved gun turrets, stronger armor, more reliable engines. Each upgrade learned from blood and experience. Crews have become adept at minor repairs in flight, plugging holes with spare jackets, rerouting cables, even using parachute cords to tie down loose panels. Ground crews are equally skilled, swapping engines overnight, patching dozens of flak holes so a bomber can fly again the next morning. The fortress is not just a plane, it's a system of men, machines, and logistics. In the last great raids before Germany's surrender, B-17s hammer Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and other remaining strongholds. Bridges collapse into rivers, marshalling yards vanish under tons of explosives, and columns of smoke rise so high they pierce the cloud deck. Even hardened crews are stunned by the devastation visible from the air. They understand that they are witnessing the destruction of a regime but also the suffering of millions caught beneath. For the Luftwaffe pilots who remain, there is no illusion left. Some still climb into their cockpits out of duty or desperation, but they know the war is lost. They describe the bomber formations as walls of iron and clouds of death, a phrase once said with contempt but now uttered with awe and despair. Many avoid direct attacks, waiting for a straggler rather than diving into the lethal crossfire of the main formation. By April 1945, Allied ground forces are closing on Berlin. The flying fortress continues to bomb supply lines and troop concentrations, softening resistance ahead of advancing armies. At the same time, crews begin flying humanitarian drops, delivering food and medical supplies to liberated areas, a stark contrast to the destructive missions they've flown for years. The aircraft that once rained bombs now carries relief, hinting at a new role in a peacetime world. Through it all, the core image remains: big four-engine bombers flying in formation, bristling with guns, their wings flashing in the sunlight, heading steadily toward their objective. German pilots once mocked that image. They saw clumsy, slow targets. They expected easy victories. Instead, they met an adversary built to endure, a machine and a cadre of men who kept coming back, mission after mission, until the sky itself seemed to belong to them. The transformation is complete. The B-17 Flying Fortress is no longer just an aircraft type or a tactical choice. It is the embodiment of Allied persistence and industrial power. It has crushed the myth of Luftwaffe supremacy and helped carve the path to victory. Its sound, that deep, steady thunder, has become the drumbeat of an empire's collapse. And yet, even with surrender approaching, the danger remains real. Each takeoff still carries risk. Each return still feels like a small miracle. The men inside the flying fortresses count the days, missions, and miles until it is finally over. They know that history will remember their aircraft, but only they will remember the cold, the fear, the smell of oil and cordite, and the long hours of steady flight into enemy fire. The end is near. The fortress in the sky has done its work. Ahead lies the moment of surrender, the return home, and the question of what to do in a world reshaped by total war. April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing. In Berlin, artillery from the Red Army can already be heard. Allied troops have crossed the Rhine and are racing eastward, capturing towns at a pace that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. For the crews of the B-17 Flying Fortress, each mission now feels like it could be the last, not because the enemy has grown stronger, but because there are fewer targets left to strike. And yet the orders keep coming: rail yards, airfields, retreating convoys, ammunition dumps. The flying fortress is still in the sky, doing what it has done since the beginning: flying into danger, delivering its payload, and returning. On the airfields of England, the atmosphere has shifted. Pilots and gunners who once trudged to their aircraft under a cloud of dread now sense a different kind of tension. The tension of nearing the end. The hangars are full of planes with months of scars patched over by mechanics who know them intimately. Men walk past rows of bombers with names and nose art worn by time and weather. They know the planes as old friends, their quirks and rattles familiar as their own heartbeats. The missions in April and early May are shorter and, on paper, less dangerous. The Luftwaffe is a shadow of itself. Fuel shortages have grounded entire squadrons. Yet anti-aircraft guns still protect key targets, and some German pilots continue to rise, more out of desperation than hope. Jet fighters appear sporadically, making lightning attacks before disappearing again. But the bomber streams are larger than ever, and the escorts sweep the skies clean. The odds have finally shifted so heavily in favor of the Allies that even rookies now feel a confidence their predecessors could never afford. Inside each B-17, however, the routine remains the same. The pre-flight rituals, the climb to altitude, the oxygen masks, the constant scanning for threats, all continue as they always have. Crews are painfully aware that dying on the last mission is no less final than dying on the first. They hold their formation tightly, check and recheck their systems, and fly with the same precision that carried them through Normandy and the Ardennes. The targets themselves tell the story of a collapsing Reich. Rail lines already cratered are bombed again to prevent repairs. Bridges blown weeks ago are hit once more to ensure they stay down. Munitions factories operate at a fraction of their capacity, yet are still assigned as objectives. German cities show scars of repeated raids, skeletal buildings, hollowed industrial zones, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. From 25,000 feet, the crews can see columns of refugees moving along roads, the white flags painted on the roofs of hospitals, the spreading fires marking yet another strike. For the civilians below, the the sound of the flying fortress is no longer an introduction to war but its constant background. They know the shape of its wings, the flash of sunlight off its fuselage, the distinct thrum of 4 big engines. Where once the Luftwaffe promised protection, now there is only the sky full of contrails and the distant chatter of Allied fighters patrolling overhead. Among German pilots, the tone has changed completely. Gone are the jokes about steel barns. Those who survived the early years speak of the B-17 with a weary kind of respect. They recall how their cannon shells punched holes but rarely broke the plane apart, how its defensive guns forced them to attack in numbers or risk annihilation. They admit that the bomber they once mocked became a nemesis that consumed their comrades, their aircraft, and ultimately their war. Back in Allied command rooms, officers are already planning for the future. Lists of airfields to convert, crews to rotate home, planes to mothball. Some flying fortresses have been reconfigured for medical evacuation or supply drops. Others are photographed for intelligence reports. The aircraft that symbolized destruction is about to become a tool of rebuilding and relief. Yet the crews still flying do not think in such terms. For them, each mission is its own world, the roar of engines, the freezing cold, the metallic tang of oxygen masks, the crack and flash of flak bursting nearby. They still write letters home, still mark bomb symbols on their fuselages, still run fingers over Lucky Charms before takeoff. The war may be ending, but their habits are forged in steel and fire. One April mission over the outskirts of Berlin becomes emblematic. A formation of B-17s strikes a rail junction feeding the last German defenders. Flak bursts around them, but the formation holds. A Mustang escort dives on a Me-262, forcing it away before it can fire on the bombers. Bombs fall with precision, turning tracks and sidings into a maze of craters. As the fortresses turn for home, crews look down at the city that once symbolized invincibility now burning under the spring sun. It is a moment many will remember for the rest of their lives. As the days pass, rumors of German surrender circulate. Radio operators catch snippets of broadcasts, and newspapers print headlines about negotiations. Yet orders continue, and the flying fortress continues to fly. Even as Allied troops liberate concentration camps and capture cities, the bombers still hammer at the last pockets of resistance. The men inside understand why. Until a surrender is signed, the war goes on, but they cannot help feeling a strange disconnect. They are destroying a nation already on its knees. In the last week of April, some B-17s are assigned entirely different missions. They drop food and medical supplies to starving civilians in the Netherlands. Parachutes drift down carrying flour and canned goods instead of bombs. For crews who have spent years raining destruction, these mercy missions feel surreal but also deeply satisfying. The flying fortress, built for war, becomes a messenger of hope. Photographs of Dutch children waving to the passing planes become some of the most enduring images of the war's end. For the Luftwaffe pilots who still fly, surrender is inevitable. Some deliberately miss their targets when firing at the bombers. Others land and abandon their planes. The war that began with daring attacks and boasts about easy kills ends with exhausted men flying obsolete machines against overwhelming odds. The once proud force that mocked the flying fortress now faces it as a symbol of everything they could not overcome. By the beginning of May 1945, Allied armies are at the gates of Berlin. Hitler is dead. The Nazi regime is collapsing hour by hour. The B-17 crews know they have helped bring this about, not alone but as part of an immense and costly effort. They have lived through the evolution of the air war, from uncertain beginnings to overwhelming dominance, and they have seen firsthand how an aircraft once doubted and derided became one of the war's decisive instruments. As they return from what may be their final missions, the airfields are quiet except for the throb of engines winding down. Men climb out of fuselages, stamping their frozen feet, exchanging looks of disbelief. They survived. The flying fortress, their fortress, has brought them back once more. Some stroke the nose of their planes, some take photographs, some simply sit on the tarmac staring at the horizon. They know history has turned a page. The war in Europe is not yet officially over, but its end is imminent. The B-17 Flying Fortress has fulfilled its mission: to strike hard, to endure punishment, to keep coming back until the job was done. Soon the question will no longer be how to destroy but how to rebuild. Yet the legend forged in these skies will endure long after the last bomber lands. May 1945. The guns of Europe are falling silent. In Reims, France, German generals sign the unconditional surrender. In England, church bells ring and crowds pour into the streets. On the muddy runways where the B-17 Flying Fortresses are parked, crews gather around radios, listening to the news. 4 years they have lived mission to mission, measuring time by takeoffs and landings. Now, at last, the war they fought from the sky is over. The final weeks of flying had felt different. The missions were shorter, the targets smaller, the opposition weaker. Some bombers were even repainted with white stripes and red crosses for humanitarian flights. Yet until the surrender came, the crews remained cautious. They had seen too many comrades lost on easy missions. They knew the danger was real until the very last minute. And even as the last bombs fell, they began to understand that their aircraft, their fortress in the sky, had become part of history. On the day the ceasefire takes effect, the airfields are alive with a strange energy. Men laugh, cry, and shake hands. Mechanics climb onto wings to wave flags. Pilots and gunners take photographs in front of their planes, capturing memories before the formations break up forever. Nose art that once seemed like a private joke now feels like a badge of survival. Each patch of aluminum over a flak hole is a testament to a mission flown and returned. The Flying Fortress itself, designed for destruction, now stands poised for a new life. Some are refitted to carry passengers, medical supplies, or food. Others ferry prisoners of war back home or fly reconnaissance over liberated territories. A few will serve as training aircraft in the newly forming U.S. Air Force. And some will simply be scrapped, their aluminum melted down to build a peacetime world. But for the men who flew them, each B-17 is a living memory, a machine that carried them through the darkest days of their lives. For German pilots, the war ends with a very different reckoning. Those who once mocked the steel barns now face Allied occupation, tribunals, and the loss of the world they fought for. In memoirs written years later, many admit that the Flying Fortress changed their view of air power. They recall how it absorbed damage they thought impossible, how its guns formed a deadly sphere of fire, and how its crews came back again and again until the Luftwaffe was bled dry. They write of respect mixed with sorrow, respect for the courage of their adversaries, sorrow for the devastation wrought on their own country. As victory celebrations sweep across the Allied nations, the image of the B-17 becomes iconic. Newspapers print photographs of the bombers returning over the white cliffs of Dover, their engines casting long shadows on the sea. Newsreels show footage of crews climbing out of battered planes, waving to cameras, smiling with exhaustion and relief. In America, parades honor the airmen. Mothers, wives, and sweethearts hold up signs with the names of planes they've read about in the papers. Children play with toy bombers painted like flying fortresses, the name already a legend. Yet behind the celebration lies a quieter truth. The cost of the bombing campaign was staggering: tens of thousands of airmen killed, thousands of aircraft lost, countless civilians caught in the crossfire of total war. The Flying Fortress had been a blunt instrument, its precision often relative rather than absolute. It helped break the Nazi war machine, but it also left scars that would last for generations. For the men who flew, these memories are as much a part of the plane's legacy as its heroics. In the months after the war, many B-17 crews return home. Some go back to farms, factories, or schools. Some stay in the military, building the foundations of the modern Air Force. Reunions begin almost immediately, small groups of veterans gathering to share stories no one else could understand. They speak of frozen oxygen masks, of tracer fire arcing past their windows, of the rumble of 4 Wright Cyclone engines holding steady through flak storms. They also speak of laughter in the barracks, of friendships forged in steel and sky, and of the quiet moments when they realized they had survived one more mission. The aircraft itself becomes a museum piece, a star at air shows, a chapter in history books. Visitors climb through its narrow fuselage, stare at the gun positions, and imagine what it was like to fly at 25,000 feet under fire. They read plaques about how German pilots once dismissed it as clumsy, only to learn its name, Flying Fortress, in fear and respect. They see the patched aluminum, the machine guns, the bomb bay doors, and understand that this was not just a plane but an entire strategy of war. In the new world of jets and nuclear weapons, the B-17 seems slow, almost quaint. But its legacy endures in every long-range bomber and airlift aircraft that follows. It proved that an aircraft could project power across oceans, that crews could strike by day with discipline and accuracy, and that industrial might combined with courage could change the course of a war. It became a template for strategic air power and a symbol of Allied resolve. For the men who faced it from below or from the cockpit of an opposing fighter, the Flying Fortress left a different impression, the embodiment of a relentless enemy that simply would not go away. German pilots once mocked its lumbering pace and heavy frame. But after years of watching it absorb punishment and return in even greater numbers, they learned that underestimating an opponent can be fatal. The Flying Fortress taught them that persistence can be as deadly as speed or firepower. Even today, surviving B-17s fly in air shows, their engines echoing across fields as spectators look up in awe. Veterans stand beneath the wings, touching the rivets, whispering the names of friends who never came back. The sound is softer now, but it carries the weight of history. It is the sound of an aircraft that helped decide the fate of nations. The story of the B-17 Flying Fortress is not just about technology or tactics. It is about people, the young men who climbed aboard knowing the odds, the mechanics who kept the planes flying, the civilians who endured the bombing, and the adversaries who faced it in combat. It is about how an idea, to build a flying fortress that could take the war to the enemy and survive, became a reality that changed the course of history. German pilots mocked it. They called it a lumbering steel barn, a clumsy giant. But mission after mission, over Europe's frozen skies, the B-17 kept coming back. It bristled with guns, shrugged off damage, and returned home on wings full of holes. It carried crews through fear, fire, and frost to strike again and again until the Luftwaffe was broken and the war's outcome sealed. In the end, the Flying Fortress lived up to its name. It was a fortress in the sky, and it did what fortresses are built to do: hold fast, endure attack, and stand as a symbol of strength. Its thunder over Europe marked not just the destruction of a regime but the resilience of those who fought to end it. Long after the last bomber landed, its legend would remain, a reminder of a time when courage and steel met at 25,000 feet and changed the world. If you enjoyed this historical story, subscribe to America Talk for more true and fascinating stories like this one, and share the video so we can bring you even more new stories.